Greetings, welcome. In this lesson, we will create a series of angled bricks. The non-recessed angled brick is fairly straightforward. The angled brick with a recess, though, presents some unique challenges. Let's get started. We'll begin by building our one by one. You could import your one by one brick start, but just for review, I'm going to build one from our peg start. So if you'd like to follow along, File, Import, Peg Start. We'll double click that outer edge. We'll come to Extrude, and our local Z is -4.8. I'll hit the Q key to get out of that, and then we'll take a look at the bottom. Our edge is still selected, and so with it still selected, we'll come to Mesh, Fill Hole, and then we have to connect these edges here. We'll use the Multicut tool, and we'll click drag, and hit return or enter. Click drag, return or enter. And there is our one by one brick start. Let's put the pivot, hit the Q key. You always want to hit the Q key when you're done using the Multicut tool. So that now we can right click to object mode. I'll select the move tool, and we want to put the pivot at the bottom. Even though in a moment we're going to move it back here, but let's finish our thought on creating our one by one brick start. We'll tap the D key. This is our reposition pivot. We'll activate the Y translate. We're now constrained. We'll hold down the V key in the middle mouse button, and we'll snap that to the bottom. We'll tap the D key, and we'll then grid snap this up onto the ground plane. And then finally, before we were to export it, we would delete all of the history. And now we could go to File, Export Selection. And this would be one by one brick start. You've probably already created this one. All right, now I mentioned a moment ago, we actually want to set this back down to where it was. And that will be made clear in a moment. We're creating a 45-degree angle, and having it sitting the peg start at the original position will make that task easier. So we're going to tap the D key once again. We're working in reverse order here. We'll make that Y active, and we're going to V-snap here. Hold down the V key in the middle mouse button. And so we've simply put it back where it was just a moment ago. We'll tap the D key, and then we're going to grid snap this down, right? So the peg is sitting back on the ground plane. And the reason that we've done this is because we need to have a 4-unit diagonal. That will give us the 45 degrees of the angled brick that we're after. That means that we need to have an edge loop here, but we don't have anything to snap to using the edge loop. Quick review. When we've used the Multicut tool primarily this first semester, we've been using it in conjunction with the control key. That allows us to create an edge loop. Also the control key with the shift key, which allows you to create increments in there. But we don't have anything to snap to. We don't have an increment at 0.8. So we're going to use the Multicut tool in its default, which oftentimes you're just click dragging, and the edge loop is projected, or I should say the edge is projected through the shape to create an edge loop. I'm going to undo that. Now if you wanted to make that straight, you could hold down the shift key, click drag, and now you've got one straight across. And we can verify that here. We've got that edge that was projected through, giving us an edge loop. Hit undo again. But we want it to be exactly on this grid. So we can't just freeform click drag. We'll do this in conjunction with the X key. So the Multicut tool, X key, I can click, and then we'll hold down the X key and we'll click. And as long as you see those orange vertex, you know that you've grid snapped. Then once we've done that, we'll hit return. Now I'm going to undo that just to do this again. We want to start with our object, with our mesh in object mode. We'll come to the Multicut tool. You see that it jumps into component mode, the light blue. We'll hold down the X key, and click, hold down the X key and click, and that edge is being projected through the shape. Once we hit return or enter, and we can verify that we've got that edge loop that is sitting on this grid. And immediately hit the Q key, right, whenever we're done using the multi-cut. And so from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, right, we have the square that we're after in order to create the 45-degree angle. We'll jump out to the perspective view. I'm going to hide my grid. We want to make sure that we're Z forward. So we're going to pick these two bottom faces, these newly created bottom faces that we created by using the multi-cut tool and grid snapping. And we're going to slide this out, and you can see that we create that angled brick. We want to be precise though, so in the side view, right, we want to pull this out 4 units. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll make this active, and we'll hold down the X key, middle mouse button, and probably better to do it up here, easier to see, right? But we're constrained on that Z axis, and we've pulled that out. Now we'll right click to object mode, and we've got our 1 by 2, since this is two lengths, we would call this 1 by 2 angled. And of course, it is not recessed. We can put the pivot at the bottom, but if we do that, if I hold this down and, tap the D key, hold that down, and V key snap, it's not in the middle of the shape. We got it to the bottom, but it's not in the middle. So let's come back to object mode, and we'll come to modify center pivot, modify center pivot. Now it's sitting in the middle. We'll tap that Y, tap the D key, and then once again V key middle mouse, make sure that's active, V key middle mouse button, and it was starting in the center, so now it's at the center bottom, and we'll tap the D key a second time. And now we can grid snap this up onto the ground plane. Let's put it right in the middle, right? So it's sitting at the origin. We'll bring that grid back, and we'll of course delete the history. And this, again, our 1 by 2 angle brick. So we'll come to File, Export Selection, 1 by 2 angled brick, or brick angle, whatever your naming convention is. All right, in the next section, we'll duplicate this, create a 2 by 2, and then finally we'll create the recessed version. Be right back. Okay, before we proceed, we should create the beveled version of this brick. Of course, if we subdivide it, right, we don't have those hard edges. So hitting the 3 key allows us to see a subdivision preview. We'll come back to 1, and then we'll just go through the process of selecting these edges. Now I don't want to double click here, and I'll just demonstrate why not. If I double click, you can see that that edge comes up onto the peg, and we don't want that. So we'll just have to manually click. I'm holding down the shift key. We'll come around, we'll get this edge, this edge, this edge, and this edge. And then we want the front edge as well. Shift click, shift click. I don't want to double click because it would get the loop going around. And we can double click this one. Shift double click, and the rear, shift double click. And then we don't need anything on the bottom. I'll hide the grid so we can see this a little bit more clearly. Pretty intuitive set of edges in terms of making that selection. And you'll recall that we would bevel, and our fraction is 0.1, and our segments are 2. We'll right click, and I'm going to hit the 5 key and the F key, and we'll hit the 3 key, and you can dolly around. I've got wireframe on shaded on, and you can also turn that off. Sometimes if you see a pinch in the model, you'll be able to tell that you missed a selection. And as I've mentioned several times, if you make an incorrect edge selection or you miss an edge selection, simply undo and reselect. So there is our 1x1 angled beveled, 1x1 angled bevel. And you would want to delete the history for it. The pivot's at the bottom currently, so we'll say edit delete by type history, and you could export this selection. All right, I'm going to hide this on a layer, and let's come back to our 1x2 start. So this is 1x2 start. You could say file new and re-import this. Now, in order for us to make our 2x2, and this technique will be familiar to you, we'll just duplicate this and we'll slide it out. We'll delete the faces that are facing each other. Always a good idea to hit the 4 key, make sure you have a clean selection, and we'll hit delete. And we'll do the same on the other side. We'll grab these 4 faces, 4 key, hit delete, 5 key, and we'll grid snap this back into position. And you'll recall that we want to combine, and you'll also recall that these vertices did not get welded or merged. So we'll draw a big bounding box around everything, and we'll come to edit mesh, merge, edit mesh, merge. Now you can hit the 3 key and you can see that there. You could export this, right? This would be 2x2 angle start, 2x2 angle start. And let's just go through the process of beveling this one. So we'll double click, shift double click, so we have that top rectangle. And let's just go down. We're not going to double click here because it would run up to the peg. We'll get the 2 edges on the back. We'll get this diagonal edge here. We'll get this corner edge. We've got 4 across the front. Now I don't want to double click because that edge loop would go all the way around, so I'll manually select them, holding the shift key. Shift key, we'll get the bottom 4. And actually I can double click the bottom because that's okay that it goes around. And again, we don't have the recess here. I'll hit the 4 key and we'll just dolly around. If you miss something, undo and make sure you get a good selection. 5 key, I'll go ahead and hit bevel. Our fraction is 0.1, and our segments are 2. We'll right click to object mode, hit the 3 key. That also allows us to make sure we've got a clean bevel. And there we have it. We could export this 2x2 angle bevel. 2x2 angle bevel. All right, I'll let you get to that point, and then we'll come back and we'll tackle creating this on a recessed version. Be right back. Greetings, welcome back. Let's create our 2x2 angled brick with a recess. Now that is one version start that we did not save. We did not create an unbeveled recessed version. But we can create one quickly from our 2x2 brick start. So file new scene, file import, 2x2 brick start, right? This is unrecessed and unbeveled, just our 2x2 start. So the first thing we want to do is select the faces of the bottom. You could shift select around, but as we learned in the last lesson, we can just draw a bounding box. And then with your control key, draw a bounding box around the faces that you don't want selected. Now we're left with those bottom faces there. We'll extrude, right? We'll come to extrude, and our offset, you'll recall, is 0.8. And we extrude a second time. And our local Z is -4, -4. So just a real quick 2-step process to give us the 2x2 brick recessed unbeveled version. And that's why we didn't have to save it, because it's just this quick to create one. All right, because in order for us to create our angled brick version with the recess, we need to start with an unbeveled version. All right, we want to be Z forward, And we're going to go through that exact same process of creating an edge loop 0.8 up from the bottom in order for us to create the 45-degree angle. Okay, we're going to jump into the front view, and we want to put the pivot back to the top. So right before you exported your 2x2 brick start, you'd put the pivot at the bottom. We're going to put it back to where it was. We'll tap the D key, and we'll make that Y active. We'll hold down the V key, and we're middle mouse snapping to this vertex here. So it is at the center top. We'll tap the D key, and then now we'll grid snap this down so that the pegs once again are sitting on the ground plane. And that allows us, right, to create our edge right at this 0.8 unit from the bottom. In other words, we have a grid to snap to. We'll select the Multicut tool, and we'll hold down the X key. We see that orange vertex. We'll hold down the X key, orange vertex, and then we'll hit return. And now we have that edge. We'll hit the Q key again to get out of the Multicut tool. And so now we have this 4-unit shape that we can create our angle for. If we look at it in the perspective view, though, note here that we can't simply pull out to create the angle because we have this interior. So that was the challenge. This just means that we'll manually create the cuts. So we'll come to the Multicut tool and make sure that you're Z forward, and we'll click drag to the top, and we'll click drag forward, and we'll hit return. We'll do the same on the other side. Make sure once again that you're Z forward, click drag, and we'll hit return. And we have to do the same on the interiors. Now this can be a little bit tricky because we're going underneath. You want to still make sure that you're Z forward. We'll click drag and click drag. A little bit hard to see that when you're upside down, but you can see that it matches here. And we'll hit return, and we'll do the same on the other side. Click drag, and we'll hit return. So if we hit the 4 key, let's hit the Q key and then the 4 key, you can see that we've got that shape there. The 2 diagonals running on the outside and on the interior recess. We'll hit the 5 key. Let's jump into the side view. Once again, Z forward. And now we're going to delete the faces on this side. I'm going to click off there. We want to be in wireframe mode. We right click to choose face, and we're going to draw a bounding box on the outer set. Don't draw too far. We could get it all at once, but I want to show you this as a 2-step process. We're going to select out here and just hit delete. Let's jump into the perspective view when we hit delete so you can see that. And then we'll do the same for that interior recess, right? We'll draw a bounding box, make sure we've got it all, not too far, right? Just to here. You've got that interior box, and we'll hit delete. And there we have it. Now we have to fill that face in, but take a moment. And if we look in this view, you can see that you've got the 45-degree, and you've got the 45-degree on the interior recess. And you've got that 0.8 going all the way around. All right, now let's finish this. We'll fill the interior hole and connect the edges, and then we'll fill the exterior hole and connect the edges. Let's right-click to edge. We'll double-click, just a 4 key to see what you have selected there. And we'll come to Edit Mesh, Mesh Fill Hole, Mesh Fill Hole. Now, of course, we have to complete the edges here. So we'll come to the Multicut, and let's just start with the first one. Click, drag, enter. Click, drag, enter. Click, drag, enter. We'll hit the Q key to get out of that. Now, you'll see here that there is a try, and it's unnecessary. We wouldn't need to draw across here because we don't need an edge there. right? We want to be judicious with our edges and not create unnecessary detail. What we can do is simply delete this edge, and that will leave us, a little bit hard to see, with 1, 2, 3, 4. And a note here about deleting edges. If I just hit the delete key, you don't want to do this. If I just hit the delete key, a vertex has been left behind. And now this would be, if we were to count these edges, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we don't need that vertex. So there is a tool, I'm undoing back, that is delete edge vertex. Now it has a slash there. You could think of this just as delete edge and vertex. And so now when I hit delete edge vertex, there is no vertex left behind. And if I count the edges, 1, 2, 3, 4, even though it's a triangular shape, it's made up of 4 edges, and it is a quad by definition. We'll do the same on the other side. We'll right click, choose edge. Let me just review. If I hit delete, this vertex is left behind, and I would have 5 edges. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I don't want and I don't need that vertex. So we'll undo back with that edge selected. We'll come to Edit Mesh, Delete Edge Vertex. And you can see there is no vertex there, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Even though it's a triangular shape, it is a quad. And we'll repeat that exact same process on the outer angle. We'll select that edge, double-click that edge, and we'll come to Edit Mesh, Mesh, Fill Hole, Mesh, Fill Hole, and then we'll complete these edges. We'll click, drag, enter, click, drag, enter, click, drag, enter, and we have the same circumstance here. We don't need to draw across. We'd still be left with this triangle. Hit the Q key to get out of the multi-cut. We'll right-click and simply choose this edge. And again, if I hit delete, I'd be left with the vertex. So we come to our Edit Mesh, Delete Edge Vertex. And 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll come here as well, select that, and we'll go to Edit Mesh, Delete Edge Vertex. And there we have it, quads all the way around. We have our outer 45-degree angle, our inner 45-degree angle with our recessed version. Now, if you wanted to create a series of these, right, we want to export this, and we will put our pivot back at the bottom. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat here. If I select my Move tool, well, based on where I started, it is in the middle. But sometimes you'll have the pivot centered here or centered somewhere else. We can always come to Modify Center Pivot, and then I'll tap the D key, and we'll use that same technique, V key, middle mouse button, and it's snapped to the center bottom. And we'll tap the D key once again. We'll grid snap this. We're going to grid snap the center to the origin. That's the best starting point. So we'll grid snap that up, right? So that is on the ground plane and also centered, right? 4 units this way, 4 units that way. And then finally, delete the history. And here we have our 2x2 angle recessed unbeveled, or you could call it start. So let's say 2x2 angled recess start. And from this, you're familiar with the technique. You could create any length version of this angled brick. Okay, let's bevel this. I'm going to duplicate and just save a version aside, but let's bevel the edges. And same as before, we'll double click the square, or excuse me, the set of squares which form the rectangle. We don't want to double click this edge, otherwise it would come up. So we're selecting these two. We want this 45. We want the front. We want this edge. I don't want to double click because I don't want those edges there. And we can double click the bottom, right? That went all the way around. We'll double click this. We'll get these angled. You'll recall from the last lesson. And we'll again, I don't want to double click because then it would come up all the way around. So I'm being careful to just manually shift, 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 and I want the front 4, missed that one. We don't need to select backwards, but we do need that angle and that angle. This corner, not double clicking, and I had that corner already, and then finally we can, oops, yeah, that's right. We can click, double click, and we don't want to double click here, right, because it would come out, so we'll shift select around. So that's all the corners for the diagonal. I'll dolly around there so you can see that. And as you know, if you bevel and you miss something, or you had an edge that you didn't need selected, simply undo and correct your selection. All right, we'll come to the modeling toolkit and we'll hit bevel, and it is 0.1 and segments 2. And we have, we'll hit the 3 key, we have our recessed angled. And this is what you would use most of the time. In a future lesson, right, we're going to create the cylinders on the bottoms, and we'll repeat this similar process, cutting across that cylinder on the bottom. But this is a very usable piece. At a distance, if you see it moving around beneath, you'll be able to see the recess. All right, in the next and final section, we'll talk about creating a lengthier version of this brick. Be right back. All right, last little addendum. Making this twice as long, or excuse me, 4 additional units long. We'll jump into the side view. We'll select these vertices here and make sure you're in the 1 mode. If we hit the 4, excuse me, if we hit the 3, it might be a little bit hard to see the selection. So just in the 1 mode, drawing a bounding box. We'll make this active, and we'll just count out 4 more units. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we'll grid snap out. Make sure that's just 4 more units. 1, 2, 3, 4, right there. And so this is not an uncommon version of the shape. If we hit the 5 key, you can see that there. All right, and you can use that same technique to lengthen your 1x1 or 1x2 as well. Any versions of the bricks. And this is pretty common for our helicopter shape builds. Okay, very good. Questions in the tech discussion. Have a good one.